Once you've gathered enough data, you can begin stage 6, which involves actually writing the case study. Now, when I am doing a discussion case, after I write that first page, I usually hold off on writing the rest of the case until I'm totally through with all my data gathering, or at least as far as I know, through with my data gathering. And I try to write it up very quickly. I think in a discussion case, I like to get a draft to the decision maker within a couple of weeks of my last visit, because discussion cases do not improve with age, and you ideally want to give them the case before they've made the decision. Because if they have made the decision, chances are they're going to want to revisit things to make the case seem as if the option they chose was clearly the best option. And frankly, if you know that a particular option is going to be the best option, then you really don't have a good discussion case. Discussion cases are best when all the options that you're considering look very plausible. Now, with a research case, it probably makes sense to begin the write-up pretty much as soon as you start doing the data gathering, because there are lots of parts of a research case that do not require the data gathering, such as the literature review and the outline of theory. So the research case you're probably going to be writing along the way, as opposed to the discussion case, where I usually try to write that within one or two intense sittings. Research cases and discussion cases have fundamentally different organizations as you write them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the discussion case organization first, and then I'll go on to the research case organization. Now, there are a number of different ways to write discussion cases, and I actually talk about this a little bit in Informing with the Case method. You can do a straight narrative style, but for the most part, if you're creating a discussion case for classroom use, what I recommend is a drill down style. And the way this style basically works is you start with an introduction. This is that introductory page that I talked about that gets written fairly early on in the process so that you can make sure you're dealing with a topic that's of interest. Now, you typically end up rewriting this when it comes time to rewrite or to write the entire body of the case. But I tend to have a very formalized notion of this introduction. In the Journal of IT Education discussion cases, which I'm editor-in-chief of, it basically has to be no more and no less than one page, because I use it kind of as an abstract. By reading that first page, you can decide if this case is something that's of interest to you, if you're an instructor thinking about whether or not to use a case in the classroom. What I then tend to do is I drill down, and I first look at the environment, and the environment might include geographic issues. It might include the industry. If there are technologies involved, it might include technologies. This is the background that we give the student so that the student is familiar enough with the broad context to make a sensible decision. Then I move to the organization itself. In most of my cases, things like the organizational culture, what the purpose of the organization is, maybe an organization chart, are all important, even if they don't directly relate to the individual decision being made. And how much time I spend on these areas really depends upon the complexity. I've had some technology heavy cases where half the case involved descriptions of the technology, because you really couldn't make any sense of the decision if you didn't understand the technologies. I've had other cases where the environment and the technologies and the geographic location really didn't seem to make much difference to it, so I covered these things much more quickly or skipped them altogether. Having covered the sort of big picture elements of the context, I then typically go to a more local level, such as the business unit or the group where the case takes place. From there, I will probably provide some information on the protagonist background, where the person went to school, what the person's work experience was, because these are things that can very heavily figure in on a decision. Then I frame the situation along with any constraints and requirements, so I'm really revisiting the decision here. And that's where the case ends, because in a discussion case, you're typically not talking about outcomes. You're talking about the context of a decision that needs to be made. After that, I will have a series of exhibits, and these exhibits normally provide some source information, maybe pictures of the technology, graphs of the income of the organization, memos that have been written. And I try to make these exhibits as authentic as possible. And often during the course of writing a case, I will actually generate my own exhibits from sources outside the company, for example, to describe what market share is in the industry, so that students get a perspective that is not entirely provided by the organization. But in a discussion case, the organization's perspective is very, very important, because decision makers make decisions based upon the world as they see it. So you really need to understand how the decision maker sees the world if you are going to replicate his or her decision process. Research cases are fundamentally different in their organization from discussion cases. Uh, the purpose of a research case is normally to validate or contradict some theory. It might be to develop theory, but whereas a discussion case tends to focus on telling the story of the context and decision that needs to be made, in a research case, the actual portion of the write-up that deals with the organization and the situation is often much, much smaller than the other elements, which is one of the complaints that I have about research cases, because I think they tend to bury some of the most interesting stuff. There are lots of organizations of research cases. A fairly typical organization would look a lot like other types of research paper. You begin with an introduction that sets up the problem, and then you have a literature review. And in research, typically the idea behind a literature review is to summarize what the literature says, but also to identify the fact that what is being explored in the paper is something that is not already well established in the literature. So you're looking for a hole in the literature as opposed to looking for a decision, which is what you would have in a discussion case. You then have some sort of framework for your research. It might have discussion questions, hypotheses, this type of thing. And perhaps it will set up the theory that you expect to be covering as part of the research. Once you've established the theory that you're going to be looking at, the next thing in a research case will normally be setting forth the data gathering protocol. Research cases are always subject to the complaint of n equals 1. In other words, you're not developing statistically valid information, you're focusing on a particular situation. And one of the ways to get around that is to emphasize the systematic way and objective way in which you're gathering data. Objectivity is much more important in a research case than in a discussion case, because in a discussion case, you're really presenting a decision from the perspective of the protagonist. And one of the inputs the protagonist may be using is comments of the case writer. So it's not unusual for me in a case to actually add that the case writer commented X, Y, Z, or an individual brought into the organization commented X, Y, Z, because I have to recognize the fact that I could in fact be impacting the decision with my own intervention as a writer. In a research case, you want to try to minimize that. Then you actually get to telling the story, the background and the situation, and maybe the outcomes that were really focused on the research. And notice this is a relatively small situation here. I mean, this is a small part of the write-up. Then you move into the analysis, where you basically take your theory and compare it to the stuff that you've brought out in the background and situation areas, and then you come to your conclusions. And then finally, you might have some appendices that would contain a lot of source documents. If you're interested in writing research cases, there's no better source than Robert Yin's case research book, which I think is like the most cited book in the social sciences. But the thing that I would emphasize here is that in the research cases, the case itself is often a very small part of the write-up, maybe even 25% or less, whereas in a discussion case, you can make a much, much richer presentation of what is going on within the organization. And that's one of the reasons why discussion cases often make for better source material than research cases.